It is the Final Word Cricket podcast and our book club, which today is becoming, for the first time and probably not the last time, a film club. I've got Jeff Lemon with me in Melbourne down the line, and also in Melbourne, in a different part of Melbourne, a man who I don't think he's technically been on the Final Word before, but he has been by dint of having appeared multiple times on the greatest season that was. It's Tony Wilson. G'day, Tony.
Thanks for having me, boys. I've certainly been a listener for a long time, so it's a bit of a thrill to be on.
It's nice that we've got this community where you have your magnificent Substacks and your podcast, which speak wholly, that's been a real presence in recent years. And we've got this nice little community, don't we, of independent media operators that you've been central to. And I suppose the film we're about to talk about, Ange and the Boss, falls into that tradition as well of people having the ability to make things on their terms.
And I also think that there used to be maybe a conflict going on between the sports and the arts, and you guys have been great bridges on that front, and I hope I have been as well. I like to think that we can make beautiful things and tell great stories through the medium of sport, and all those high art snobs who have overlooked sport over the years are overlooking something great.
I know that with our history of talking about cricket film and cricket books, I mean, I just want to establish that you've got cricket chops as well. You famously toured India back in 2001 for that extraordinary Border Gavaskar series when, you can pick up the story, but you're watching it on telly and you're like, I just have to be there.
Well, Gilchrist, I think, made something like, did he make 121 off 141 balls or something? And I was sitting there, I didn't have Foxtel at the time, so I was watching it at my parents' house, and I just lost a job on Channel 7, and I was freshly unemployed. And I was thinking, why am I not there watching this? And 4 days later, I'd been to the Indian embassy and got a visa, and I was suddenly there in Kolkata, and I arrived during Holi, and they splashed me with dye, and then played street cricket where they were smashing the stumps through the concrete, and Bradman died that week, and then there was this test, the start of the final frontier miracle, come back from India, and just to be there. Actually, here's a great rumour I heard. The word was coming into the crowd that the Australians had said, it was going to be over by day 4. So day 4 was going to be at the races. Mark Waugh says we're going to the races day 4. It's kind of like, of course, day 4 was spent. I sat in the scoreboard in 40-degree heat watching Laxman and Dravid put on about 380 for the 5th wicket or whatever it was. But what a test and what a series.
If you could give me one opportunity, to go back through history and say you've got 4 days to get to any test match in the 150 years, that's the one. So I'm very envious of the fact that you were at liberty to do it. And it's a bit incongruous that we're going to talk about a football film today on a cricket podcast, but there is that link because you've got that cricket history link. Cameron Fink, who you made the film with, was my camera operator on the first Ashes tour I did in 2013 and worked with Adam and I in 2019 as well. And so there is this strong cricket link, and there's quite a link through Ange Postecoglou as well, who is a cricket nuffy in his own right, but also someone who we've talked about a lot in relation to Angelo Matthews. Adam and I have a plan that Postecoglou and Matthews, Big Ange and Big Ange, have to somehow get their own podcast going together. I don't know what it's about, don't know what they'll talk about, but I think we can make it happen.
Well, I like to think there's some simpatico there, and I can just lapse into cricket if we start doing too much, and I won't mind any longly drawn bows that bring it back to cricket, if you like. But yes, it's a football story we're going to embark upon.
Your first football love. Well, I actually thought I'd put on today. Your friend and mine, Dylan Leach, bought me for my 40th birthday. He found in a warehouse somewhere online a Hawthorn original hoodie from 1992, which was the season when you were on the Hawthorn list, of course. So I thought I'd wear this for the show, and your dad being a premiership player back in 1971 for the club. So, I mean, football association, football, soccer, what we're about to talk about now. But you, like a lot of Australians, came to the round ball game as a secondary love and really took to it with some enthusiasm, and you've been able to document the Socceroos around the world and do many other things. So this film is in keeping with one of your special passions.
Well, you're right. I was delisted 150 days after I was listed in 1992. A bit of a tragedy. I think I'm getting over it slowly at the age of 52. But basically, what happened in that 10 years is I did sort of spit the dummy with my first love, footy. And while you were doing hard yards at Waverley, Adam, I was sort of a little bit grumpy with the Hawks and did discover round ball football mainly through that game at the MCG. I was there for that one as well with the Iran disaster. And I watched what that did to a population, like just to see the happiness at 70 minutes and the devastation at 90. It was actually transformative. I hadn't really seen that happen to a stadium in my life of watching sport. And I became quite obsessed with the idea of one day seeing the Socceroos qualify after seeing that disaster. And that took me to Uruguay and then later to Germany for the World Cup in 2006. And a bit of an addiction with Cam, my co-director. We've just gone to World Cups together. And so, round ball football has been very much a last 25 years sort of thing. So I'm not really a Johnny come lately anymore, but I genuinely love it. And this story, where more than anything else, I hope I'm a sporting storyteller, and it came across my lap sort of in about 2013 that I was doing a talk at Victoria College in Footscray, and the Paul Mavroudis, who does a blog for the South of the Border blog for South Melbourne Hellas, he was there as an academic, and he basically just told me about. I didn't know Puskás had been in Australia. I didn't know that this giant of the game, a sort of a top 10 of all time type figure, had lived in my city and had lived in the back blocks of my city in Ashburton, and had coached a Greek team. And as a guy who'd read The Age back to front, literally starting at the back and working to the front for my whole teenage life, I just couldn't understand how this story had missed me. And I thought, if it missed me, it might have missed some other people as well.
And perhaps how a character like that might miss an Australian audience that pays a little bit of attention. They'd know who Pele was, they'd know who Maradona was, but they might not know who Puskás was. Give us a sense of who this character is, Ferenc Puskás, the great Hungarian, and where he stood and what he was in the game.
Well, this was all stuff I learned in the 2010s, but he is Ange Postecoglou is almost the first voice we hear in the film, and he says, look, if you lined up 100 journalists from around the world, 90% of them would have him in their top 10 of all time. And the numbers are kind of they're phenomenal. Like, they're 83 goals in 84 internationals, 514 goals in all first division games. He played in the team, the Magical Magyars, that won for 7 years. They lost one game, and that one game, of course, for any Hungarians you've ever met, it was a game against Germany, the World Cup final in 1954 in Switzerland. They were 2-0 up after 8 minutes. Puskás scored. He rolled an ankle in the semi-final and it wasn't fit, and they got run over 3-2. So that national tragedy is mentioned in our film. But he then, in 56, the Russians come into Budapest. They quash the uprising in Hungary. He goes into exile. So he was out of the country at the time. Half the team went back, half the team chose not to go back. There was a two-year ban for any person who abandoned their country, and so he went. He didn't play for 2 years, and then in his 30s, and this is really quite phenomenal. A guy who started playing in 1949, who's the best player in the world in 1956, who's dominated the game like that. He then goes overweight and reasonably old, like in his 30s, is now, in that era in particular, is regarded as an old footballer. And he tops La Liga's goal kicking at Real Madrid 4 out of 5 years. This is in the Di Stefano area as well. He scores 4 goals in a European Cup final. And, now when you walk down the Avenue of Champions into the Bernabeu, his is the last statue you see. So he really, like, you can't even, the award for the best goal in the year is called the Puskás Award. And how many awards have FIFA named after people? It's kind of, is it 2 or 3 or there's not many.
Yeah.
And so this guy is proper football deity stuff. And in Hungary, it's even bigger. Like, he's got the metro stations, the stadiums, and the regime there are basically using him. They're sports washing their politics at the moment and using the image of Puskás as the sort of the great Hungarian domination era. There's a real Puskás revival going on.
I just want to provide a bit more context to the time frame of this documentary. So you come across the tale in 2013. The film's being released in 2025, and maybe you can add some information about how successful the release has been in this answer, but also why it's taken so long to go from conception to completion when you're dealing with a figure in Puskás and another in Postecoglou, who are two incredibly watchable and incredibly significant figures in the sport and around the world. Why did it take so long to get to this point?
Well, it's partly our fault. Use fault maybe is the word. I mean, if I was telling someone how to make a film, there's two ways of doing it. One's to do it by the sort of film school way, which is to write a treatment, go off to funding bodies, get money in place, have backing from networks or production companies, and get the film made. What we've done with our two films, and we had an earlier one called The Galahs that was about a trip to Ireland by BFL footballers in the 1960s. But for both films, we've decided, well, hey, let's just go and talk to the people that were in the world of this. Cam Fink, who's been a cameraman and editor and all-round multimedia genius in your lives, he's in my life in an even more prominent sense. And I just dragged Cam to meet, well, eventually it was Ange Postecoglou, but we had Paul Trimboli, we had Mickey Peterson. We just sort of, the easy and fun part of this sort of stuff is to line up the characters that are relevant to the story and just film them. And it gets really exciting at that point as well, because you kind of get the stories. And I knew we had a film from the way that people were crying when they were talking about him, by how funny they were when they shared the stories. And so I knew I had a film. And then Rob Heath, our third member of the party at that point, he did a lot of the accumulation of footage from overseas, Hungarian Archive, BBC, ABC, SBS. We've got all the screeners, so we can actually cut something together. We've got the pictures to go over our interviews. So something by 2020, it's even taken a few years, but by 2020, we've got something that looks like a film. But what we then did was add up our seconds of archival material and find out that our bill, that had only been 60,000 for the Galahs because there was not enough footage in the 1960s of this tour. But our bill for this one with lots of footage was like 320,000 or something like that. And so we just went into financial apoplexy and stasis as well. And so we kind of have treaded water as we've tried to work out what to do. We've asked everyone for money. But when you don't ask at the front and you've made something already, it actually gets harder to get the money. So we've run crowdfunding through the Documentary Australia Foundation. We've had some kind donors, got a bit of money from my dad. But we went for the cheaper option of aiming for film festival only release instead of a mainstream cinema release or a streaming release. And when we did that, we got in the Greek Film Festival at the end of last year, 1,000 people at the Astor at the opening night. We were assigned two screenings, and it was expanded out to 8 screenings. So suddenly we had this kind of hit on our hands. We've been over to Sicily and the Palladino d'Oro, the sport film festival over in Italy, and gotten the finalists for best football film. So we've sort of had these wins over the last 5 months. It's kind of vindicated what we thought, which is that this is I think it's the best football documentary ever made in Australia. I mean, there's not many to go up against it. So, I mean, there was a reasonably good one made about November 16, November 2005. That's a pretty good doco. But it's not as, their players aren't as good as ours. Our players are so funny, they're not media trained. So there's a certain beauty to the way the stories come out. They feel really fresh. And I'd actually challenged whether there's a better sporting documentary for comedy of player answer that's ever been made in Australia.
There's definitely a looseness to it, which is what makes it so enjoyable. We don't need to go through the entire story, but basically the concept being that Puskás comes out to coach in Australia in the 90s, which is an odd thing in itself. Like, you could make a movie about that. It's sort of fish out of water stuff in a way. But in a way, he fits in beautifully in the Australian suburbs. And then you've got this link with Ange Postecoglou, the player, who becomes Ange, the coach. I was thinking, if you were trying to make this now that Postecoglou has become the celebrity that he's become with the profile that he's got, do you reckon it would be impossible to make this movie now as opposed to then?
Couldn't. I don't think we could get into his field of vision. Like he'd be so, gate kept, wouldn't he? I mean, we were so incredibly lucky. The key moment in this film that happened in 2017 was that we scheduled an interview with him, and 2 days before it was scheduled, he lost the job. Or would you say he resigned the job? I think probably correctly you'd say he resigned the job as the Socceroos manager. But it was an absolute shit show. Like, who knew what was going down? There was politics going everywhere. You could tell he was not happy with Football Australia. Football Australia weren't happy with him. It was pursed lips. It was angry. No one knew what he was going to do next. And I certainly didn't think he would keep his appointment with two filmmakers he didn't know to go to Bob Janes Stadium and sit in the stands for an hour and talk about South Melbourne Health and Puskas. But he did. He just we emailed him and said, "Do you want to cancel?" And he said, "No, I'll come and do it." And so he came and gave us an hour and a half, and he was funny, and he was obviously actually. Now I've seen him in press conference. I know it might be his default demeanour. He is not. It wasn't sort of bubbling or laughing, but he was funny. He was funny and flat, if you know what I mean. So he was. It's
He's
a very
dry. He's
a
always
very
dry.
downbeat, dry performance, but it's perfect. And I also could tell, and this is a beauty of the film, is that there's a closeness to the South Melbourne players from that team, like many championship winning or premiership teams, and they know the stories. So the story of him taking the platter of pasta, instead of sharing it with the boys and eating it himself, they all just tell it in turn. They know it, and they know the story of the three possibilities in football. Yeah, can winning, can losing, or we make it the draw. That's the philosophy of Puskás, and they tell it with joy and relish. And they've been telling it to each other for 25, 30 years, and there's something really beautiful about them telling it now to an audience. And I think Ange got that, and he wanted to share that, and this is important in his life, maybe the most important thing in his life. Which ties into things that are in the film, like his love for his father, or at least his respect for his father, and that South Melbourne Hellas was their home together, in a kind of a refuge from the rigours of being a first generation migrant to Australia.
And this is the other strong theme, right? So, I mean, there's the Puskás bit coming out and I suppose coaching in Australia in Parkmore, back in the part of Melbourne that I grew up in, and having an academy in Keysborough and all the rest of it. But then ultimately South Melbourne, Hellas, and what that all means and what this club means to families, including Postecoglou, that difficulty and assimilation that he refers to with his dad calling it a sanctuary when he would get to go to the South Melbourne Hellas club. My dad became a different man is another quote from Postecoglou here. And I suppose how all that came to pass with post-World War II migration, these enormous crowds, clubs like Brunswick Juventus and Heidelberg, another Greek club, Melbourne, Croatia, Marconi, all around the country are similar things going on. And this is where it provides, I guess, a bit of a time capsule of post-World War II migration, but up in that period of the late 80s and early 1990s.
Well, what a league. I mean, it's absolutely bananas. And we've got he's only got one line in the film, but there's a great, great book by a guy called Joe Gorman, who wrote a book called The Death and Life of Australian Soccer. And it is such a great read about the whole history and the migrant history and involvement in the game. But this is, Rob Heath was really strong on this when we were first plotting out the film, that it would work if we're going to tell the story of Puskás coming to Australia. We had to say what he walked into, as you can't just show South Melbourne Hellas in 1989 and say that's it. So we sourced footage from Acme of Greeks walking down gangplanks at Station Pier. And you're not looking at the Postecoglou family, but you're looking at the absolute equivalents as they come down. These kind of, escaping civil war, wearing suits, and then following them into the Greek men's clubs of Melbourne, and dancing in Paran, and the fish markets, and Couchman's stories on how many Greeks are in Paran, and we absolutely, rickety trams going through the middle of Collins Street, and we absolutely tried to capture what this thing was, what a migrant club was, and that this was different to other places in the world where each of the migrant communities made their own sanctuaries, and then it rose to become our actual national league. It just hasn't happened elsewhere. And I think Joe Gorman's the one that says there were more countries. There were more countries with Yugoslavian. There were more Yugoslavian countries in the NSL than there were countries in Yugoslavia at the time. It was it was incredible.
And the part, there's a key part of the migrant experience. Anyone who's travelled extensively, anyone who's lived overseas for any period of time, language barriers, the ways you've got to try to work around them. And so you've got Puskás, who doesn't speak English, but he did manage a team in Greece for long enough to learn pretty good Greek. So he's coming in to coach for the Greek club because there are enough people there who'll be able to speak Greek to translate that for the rest of the team. And that's Postecoglou's other job is to be his translator, to be his chauffeur, to drive him around in the Datsun. There's this beautiful clash between sort of world football royalty and this incredibly naff Australian suburbian, which is so far removed from any possibility of that. It's a delicious, irresistible combination.
Well, he's living behind a garden supply, so that you can actually see. And I think there was even a picture we didn't put in, just like dump trucks with mulch are right behind this sort of 2-bedroom weatherboard. And you sort of think, where would Cristiano Ronaldo stay if he came to coach Central Coast? Would he be? Would they put
in the big sauce bottle?
Yeah, the big sauce bottle. Exactly. They'd refurbish it into a multi-trillion-dollar apartment. But what Puskás had, he certainly had ego. So he knew how great he was, and he was feted everywhere he went, and he possibly enjoyed Australia because he had a little bit of a rest from that, I'd say. And I think certainly his wife, Elizabeth, enjoyed Australia because there was a little less of the grabbing a hold of Ferenc and being able to travel and walk through the streets sort of thing. But I think he was a very humble man. Like, there's not many stars that would have put up with the garden supply in Ashburton, and but he came out here and did clinics, and he wasn't paid for those clinics, and it was a bit of a falling out. And the Hungarian community embraced him, and some members of that community made sure that he was looked after here, and helped him find a job at South Melbourne. South Melbourne didn't seek out Ferenc Puskás. Ferenc Puskás sought out South Melbourne. They basically got a call, and there's a great little bit in the doco where we've got this guy called George Vasilopoulos, he was the first guy we spoke to in the whole interview process, and he sobbed through the interviews. He just is a crier. And one of his friends, he just goes, then, out of the blue, like a miracle, we get a call. It's Puskás, and it's just this beautiful story of how, that they just bumped into this miracle and this thing happening to them. And imagine he's the Panathinaikos coach that no other Greek team has ever made a European Cup final. Puskás takes them to the final in 1971. They lose to Cruyff's Ajax, but he's that thing in Greece. Imagine that coach. He's enormous in Greece, and the idea that he just sort of offers himself to the Greek club in Melbourne is just crazy.
Yeah, and then he's there, and what there is as well. I like how you set up the fact that they're kind of success starved by the high standards they set themselves, and those days at Middle Park. I mean, I knew a little bit about what the Middle Park Stadium was before it was knocked down. I didn't realise it was a casualty of the Grand Prix push, by the way. I didn't know those two things were linked, but before they moved on to Lakeside Oval, Bob Jane, and all the rest of it. But it looks totally magical. One of your guests described it as one of your talking heads, like stepping into an alternative universe when walking in the gates there at Middle Park. And, once Puskás has been signed there in a restaurant in Drummond Street, I love all of that detail, that he would walk into this sanctuary for Greek Australia. And, it's a bit rough and ready around the edges, the flares, the pitch invasions and so on. But that was all kind of part of the shtick. It was part of the charm, and that was at the time anyway the culture of Australian football at grounds like Middle Park.
Oh, and actually watching, because we had to pour through hours and hours of game day footage to find which goals and other highlights to put into the film. And I just came out thinking, well, I love sport in the 90s. Why was I not going to this? Now, there really is a question to be asked about the migrant communities and the Anglo communities of my generation, you know, and I knew there was racism and you know the whole there is this the scars I think that the football people now wear, and they wear them with honour, that with the sort of the Sheila's, Wogs and Pufters expression that was used by Johnny Warren, that I think's been embraced as a bit of a war cry by the people that were on the wrong end of the media treatment in that issue, or even just the mainstream Australian treatment in that era. But I do sort of see the frustration, because I would have loved that. Like, just watching that, it really was an incomparable atmosphere. We've got so much footage of 14-year-old girls in the crowd with Catherine Wheels and who I now see at the Victory. You know, that there's no reason to think that, other than the occasional thing that goes wrong in large sporting event crowds, and yes, there were some bad ones, but yeah, it was we only heard that. We didn't hear how much fun it was, I reckon.
And you talk about the footage that you've got to find. I reckon the most magical footage in the whole piece is that local football bit of Puskas, the coach, when he's here, but he must be 60 or whatever he is, and he's playing local football. And, you know, he's not in the best shape you've ever seen. He's not running guys down from behind, but his touch and his control is still, you can still see it. You can still see the level at which he is above everybody else around him, even though he's moving like a battleship.
Oh, he's got the bowling ball in the gut, hasn't he? And it's such a gut. I actually wonder if our film would be 50% worse if he wasn't quite so fat. It really is a godsend that he's so fat, because he's got these dainty feet and this beautiful control and movement and skill and ball sense. There's one where he flops down towards the ground like a whale and hits the top of his head. He heads it into the top corner, and you're going, wow, you know, like to be this gifted with this body shape in his 60s is just incredible. And that footage that you're talking about there, Jeff, that is that was gifted to us by, and I talked about the traumas of the cost of footage, but there was the Parkmore Football Club, which were originally the Kek Duna. They're actually Hungarians who lived in Serbia. So there's parts of the Hungarian community, or parts of Serbia, that have Hungarian-speaking Serbs, and those Hungarians came to Keysborough and started the Kek Duna Club. And Alex Varga was one of those founders. He's a talking head in our film, and basically they gave us this incredible footage of him visiting in the 80s, and of course when Puskas was in town and playing an old boys game or pulling on the gear, they could, you know, the meat tray raffle would have had 5,000 entrants instead of 200, you know, and that's the feel of this event. There's there's goulash on the sidelines and hugs for him and VB cans and picnic rugs and the words of the Times journalist who's written a lovely review of the film, that he is smoking half volleys into the back of the net in this very incongruous cow paddock of a scene.
And what a left peg, as Jeff says. It's extraordinary. Watching him just pummel balls into the top corner in the footage that you've got before he goes to South. And some other stuff as well. I assume there must have been like some overage Hungary stuff that he was playing in, or whatever that you had access to as well. That header comes from, that must have been overage Hungary.
That was actually his return to Hungary. So in 1981, so he wasn't locked out of Hungary when he came to Australia, but he was still a bit of a nomad. But up until 1981, from 1956 to 1981, which was exactly 25 years?
Yep.
Yeah. So there was a rule that the communist regime came up with, was that if you deserted the army, they would decide whether they would apply a death penalty to you, and there was a 25-year limit on that. And so he decided to not try it 24 years or 23 years. He waited the full 25 years, and as if they would have killed Puskás. But at the same time, he didn't take any risks, and he went back after the 25th year. And that game where we've got him flopping like a huge bellied whale to nail his diving header, that is a footage from his testimonial match, his return match, where he scored every goal in the game, because it was that sort of an event. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some absolutely charming stuff and commentary from his team. So where we get to is he takes over in 89-90. They win the NSL Cup, which I kind of compare to. It feels like a night premiership
Yeah,
in
that's
footy
right.
terms from back in the day, pitch invasion, of course. But 1990-91, you document the season quite nicely with match highlights and scores running down the bottom of the screen. But the best bit was just the philosophy side of things, and Postecoglou, guys just running up the ground trying to score at all times, being told not to track back, being told to stay there and have a crack whenever you can. I sent you a text, Tony, saying it reminded me of when we talked at great length about the 1989 grand final when you wrote that beautiful book 5 years ago of the Malcolm Blight approach to coaching Geelong. If we kick more goals than you, we win the game of footy. It feels like Puskás at a very similar time was implementing a very similar thing, except his inspiration came from Spain in the 1960s, where he wanted everyone just to have a ping.
Well, they had the best team in the 1960s at Real Madrid, and he didn't understand why. If they score 3, we'll just score 6 or 7, and that's kind of how it went. And Ange, it's funny because I was just thinking of the way Ange has been criticised this year, and it is that why are you still attacking when you've had 2 people sent off? Is that just damaging to the 9 people that have still got to play? Is it sort of is there a simplicity to that? And he's copped that, I think, and in some ways you say, well, this is a direct lineage. Like Puskás never said, well, let's back it off. It was fully fledged attack, and it was meant to be fun. And actually, Ange says, look, I think he was ahead of his time, playing wingers up the ground and a number 9 and these sorts of things. And he thinks that's become more of a fashion in the modern era, and that we'd been anchored in 4-4-2. We'd had a lot of British influence in the game in the 1980s. So he says he thinks that Puskás got a little bit of a break on the competition just by being more free and more attacking. But at the same time, he says, look, it wasn't the tactics that stuck with Ange. It's the person management. It's the sense of happiness that Puskás was able to engender in a club room. He said that it was like having your grandfather coaching. It was kind of, you didn't want to let him down. It sounds like he was just sort of gentle. He was funny. He'd pull you in if it was raining too much. Apparently, we didn't put this in the film, but they'd have these scratch matches against the reserves. And you know how the reserves, well, I certainly know because I'm a reserves guy at Hawthorn. The reserves guys are always like 130% when they play the seniors. And so sometimes you can get a good result going. And they said that Puskás would never allow the game to end until the seniors had won. So it was just like, it had to always be that the seniors won and that it made you feel good. He was just he was a mood guy. And they have they just use words like magical, fun, joyous. This is the time they had.
And it does seem like that, I don't know, that attitude that you're supposed to enjoy the game, which is something that's been seen as revelatory. Maybe there's a bit of that in what Brendan McCullum's tried to do. You're supposed to enjoy playing first and foremost. Whether it can stand up in really hard-edged professional sport is something else. But there is something of that to Postecoglou's approach, the way that he's gone about it. You've got to enjoy playing football, and it's got to be good to watch. And I suppose the player management thing, you saw that when Postecoglou goes to Japan, there's echoes of Puskás in that he has to do it through translators. He can't communicate with that team in his first language, but he's able to go over there and win titles despite those difficulties, which is something that his mentor does. There are all of these little reflections from, it seems like that couple of seasons with Puskás are the most influential on Postecoglou.
And we did try and do a little Postecoglou legacy montage, very expensively actually, because we had to access Asian Cup footage and J-League footage and A-League footage and Celtic and then Tottenham. But there's a moment where Postecoglou is talking to his Japanese players, and he comes in and goes, today was for our supporters, next week is for us. And he's saying it through translators. And it's absolutely spine-tingling on the back of the neck just to hear how his cadence, the translator picking it up, and then the way the players rise out of their seats and roar after this walking across the room translated exchange. And it just goes, for me, they're the 19 seconds in the film where I go, oh, this guy is actually a genius, Postecoglou. He is truly charismatic, and these players love him. And there's obviously, we were looking at an interesting time with Tottenham. Is it falling apart? Is he going to lose his job? Have the injuries played their role, or is it that it's not working with this group? From what the group's saying, I don't know if it's Postecoglou, but it'll be interesting to see what happens. Sometimes just results can condemn you.
This is something I sometimes say offhandedly to my friends over here, Tony. I mean, so look, we're talking about here the influence of Migrant Australia and how maybe we didn't tap into it as much as we might have, but how it influenced the very English game, which that was how it was seen, wasn't it? A game of football here in Melbourne, or rather in Australia, would have been seen through the England lens quite a bit through the period of time that you're documenting with what was covered from what wasn't the Premier League then, was it? But people had their teams in England, didn't they? And even the football pools and that type of thing. But it works the other way too, I think, maybe with Postecoglou, because as we've learnt from watching him on Offsiders over the years, he's just a classic Melbourne sports nut, right? Like he was coaching Tottenham in a game last year at the same time or on the same day that Carlton were playing in the prelim. And I joked at the time to some mates, like, make no mistake, he'll care just as much about Carlton winning today. Because he's a footy person. He's one of us. And I wonder with that bit that Jeff describes there in Japan, and you as well, about this is for the fans and how fired up he is, because he's got a bit of like Melbourne footy culture in him. He can give a rousing 3/4 time speech. That's his vibe as well. I love all that. And you can kind of see the way that footy Anglo culture gets into the NSL in 1990, 91 as well. Little things. They run through a banner. When have you ever seen a soccer team run through a banner? Beautiful bit. The way that they have a grand final. I love the fact that Australian Association football is resolved by a grand final rather than just a league system. So I like the intersection between those two things, and that effectively Postecoglou has grown up in sports nut Melbourne's not just a soccer thing. It's bigger than that.
No, he is a proper Carlton supporter. I mean, he picked one of Carlton's coaches. He was on the panel. They had 4 or 5 people that picked a Carlton coach. I think it was Brendan Bolton. So it might not have worked that well, but Postecoglou is enough of a Carlton person to get that sort of a role. His story, I mean, the great regret for me I loved this film, but, I also sort of thought as I was making it, look, there's going to be the great Australian sporting film will be on him. What he's done, going from starting the soccer team in grade 6 and making himself the coach. And if you read Ange Ball, it's a great book by Vince Rigari, just to sort of see how far he fell. So, after there was a famous falling out with Craig Foster on SBS when he was the youth team, the Socceroos the Australian youth team manager, and he fell quite a long way. He just didn't have jobs, and he was starting academies, and he was Whittlesea Zebras, and it's a long way down where you're not even close to A-League jobs, and then Frank Farina gets done for drink driving. Basically Ange gets plucked out, bit of a lifeline, mid-season, raw, and within 3 years they've strung together the world record for number of undefeated games. Yeah, it is an incredible journey. And then how do you go from raw to the next thing, and how do you go to the Socceroos? It is a great story, and someone will make a great film about it. Should be me, Ange. Should commission me.
I was going to say, there's another part. I feel like there's a part 2 to all of this, because, and I won't, in a way, I feel like I don't want to talk about the 91 grand final, as beautiful as, it won't surprise you to learn, Tony, that I often have dreams about like going to Princess Park, going to VFL Park, and watching Hawthorn play. Like, for some reason, I can't get out of that childhood era of going to those more suburban grounds. But watching Olympic Park on that day in early 1991, glorious day, a little bit like 89 grand final day, where not a cloud in the sky, and it just feels like the NSL peaked. It probably didn't. Others who watched it more closely than me will have different views, but the way the game was won, the stunning penalty shootout, which again, I don't want to spoil by detailing how bonkers it was, but Postecoglou being crucial to that, being the premiership captain, the lap of honour, the flares, the crown invasion, the works. It's like there's something magical.
Beautiful.
It is so beautiful. I can't stress how beautiful that scene is. Like, it was really moving to me as someone who loves that era of Melbourne sport, and I'm sure you took great delight in piecing it all together.
Well, I couldn't believe it. Again, I said I didn't know about Puskas coming to Australia. Well, I didn't know about this game either. And so when you're making a film, and one of the issues we had with this story was, well, really, is the sport central? If you make the documentary of the Final Frontier tour in 2001, the sport is central. Like Australia hasn't won there for years and years. There's an incredible sporting narrative. And whatever you drag from off the field but this is cricket at its absolute most important. And I guess one of the barriers we had with this film was, look, 1990-91 NSL football in the context of Puskás, it's not even that important. It's important to Greeks in Melbourne and it's important to ethnic communities, but us 30 years later can't pump up this result to be the most important thing to anyone. And in fact, the story probably is that it's not even that important to Puskás. And in fact, as the penalty shootout's going on, some of the funniest footage is Puskas's level of calm. And Paul Trimbolli uses the expression, "Oh, look, was he worried he was going to miss his dinner because it had gone into extra time?" He didn't look like he was highly engaged with the result. And look, he cried at the end of that game, and that meant a lot to the players. But we had the issue of whether the sport is important enough, the cup they're chasing. And Cam was really good on this. He kept saying, look, our story is not this results-driven story. Our story is Puskás the whole way. We can't lose sight of Puskás. And so what we found was that, what a bonus, so that we were not chasing a results or a sport action type of documentary, and yet the bonus we were gifted in minutes 60 to 70 of the film is this once in a lifetime sort of exciting game.
And look, you and Jeff have already gone back and forth on what this might mean in terms of influencing Postecoglou's career, which is such a lovely through line as well, and the stuff with his dad. And again, I'm reluctant to go into every last detail because I want people to go and see this. And that's the beauty of this, right? All this work, a project that, what I was alluding to in my question earlier, wasn't you guys sort of leaning on the splice at the non-strikers end. It was more the difficulty in getting that footage released. And I remember you came to me 4 or 5 years ago and we got a piece placed in the Guardian at the time with Jonathan Wilson and other hurdles you needed to clear. We had lunch together last year before a Hawthorn game, and you told me this was stuffed, like it was going nowhere. To think that a year on, you've smashed the film festival scene, you've been nominated for awards, and the great, wonderful, triumphant news that you are going to full-on national release on the 13th of March. Tell us all about it.
Yeah, so we've got a national release. It's going to be in every state except Tasmania at this stage. We'll get it into Tasmania, but we on the 13th to the 16th of March or 17th of March. Let's use that window. 13, we start in Coburg in Melbourne with Gus Salakis as the special guest. The 14th, we've got Trimmers, Paul Trimbolli at the Nova. We've already sold out one cinema, a 250-seater, and they're filling up one half an hour later. And on Saturday and Sunday, they're the big ones, really, because in every capital city, you'll find a Palace cinema that's got Ange and the Boss on. The times I can't tell you yet, but if you look up your Palace guides, it'll be there. Norton Street in Sydney, James Street in Brisbane, Rain Square in Perth. In Melbourne, there's Balwyn, there's Brighton, there's Penny Lane. And then we've also got Q&As at the Lido in Hawthorn with Kim Monteliadorus, Westgarth in Melbourne as well. And then we come to Sydney on the Monday. Again, we've got Q&As. We're going to Brisbane on the 27th. We're going to Adelaide on the 29th. So it's really got a sense of a national Q&A tour. And if people keep going to the film, I think they're just going to keep rolling it out. So we're hoping March will be Ange and the Boss month. And, it's a rare thing for a sports doco to hit the big screen here in Australia, and a rarer thing for it to be entirely Australian made and produced and distributed and publicised, which is all being done by two people.
It's a huge success story on a personal front. To say chuffed for you, all the work you've put into this. You're a brilliant storyteller. You're a real inspiration on what you do as well. For what Jeff and I have done, you're a real leader on independent media in Melbourne and around Australia, and we've been able to follow in your footsteps. And we're chuffed for you. We're so pleased that people can now go and see this film. Everyone I've spoken to who went to the film festival and saw it has said such beautiful things, and I now feel that way as well, having had the privilege of seeing it too. So, Tony Wilson, congratulations to you. Congratulations to Cam Fink and to Rob Heath and your dad, who was the executive producer, and the rest of the team that worked on this wonderful project, Ange and the Boss.
Oh, thank you. And it's angeandtheboss.com is where you'll find the sessions and tickets. So thank you, guys.